Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to try something just a little bit new. We're calling this NunleyMath Teacher Talk. NunleyMath Teacher Talk. So instead of doing a lesson on pre-algebra or algebra 1 like we would typically do during our time together, we're going to focus a little bit on what it's like to be a teacher and how we as teachers look at student data in order to make decisions about quality instruction. So let me give you a classroom set of data. Now this is fictitious data, meaning I've made these names up, I've made these numbers up as well. But I want you to think of this as being Bell 1 math scores. And I want to point out that these are all going to be observable data points. I mention that because one of the challenges we currently face in mathematics is with the proliferation of technology and social media tools, students are getting help from one another a lot more than we used to see. It's certainly much easier for students to get help from one another, which isn't necessarily always a bad thing, but when you're attempting to assess an individual student's understanding, it certainly makes it more difficult to gauge that when they're receiving help from their peers. So these are all data points that would have been acquired in class in a monitored situation. So we can view these as pretty reliable pieces of data. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to pause the video for just a moment. I want you to look at these 15 students and look at their five assessment scores and see if you can spot any students that have data sets that draw your attention or things that stand out or are noticeable to you. Just pause the video, take a second, see what if you can come up with a handful of names, and then restart the video when you're ready. I'm going to assume that if you're planning on doing that, you've already done that, and I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. As I look through lists of student data as a teacher, I'm always looking for certain anomalies or certain trends. So when I look at these 15 students, if these 15 students were all in my class, I would be looking for specific things. For example, when I look at Alejandro's scores, I see that he scored an 85, a 91, an 86, a 79, and a 90%. So in my class, if I've just given my assessment on perimeter and area of rectangles, and I'm primarily concerned with how a student understood or what level of understanding that student has, and I look at Alejandro and I see he scored a 90%, and I go back and compare that to his other scores. This is a pretty good score for Alejandro. I'm pretty impressed and pleased with this, and so he's not really throwing up any red flags for me. I'm then going to go down to Armanpreet. Looking at their scores, I'm going to see a 73, an 84, an 82, an 88, and 100. Once again, I'm seeing that this student has done pretty well. And I'm going to go through every student just like that and begin to pull things out and start to look for things that maybe will require a little bit extra of my attention. Hopefully you've got a list of a handful of names of students that really popped out from this list from you. I'm going to spend some time today focused on Bella because I'm looking at Bella's scores. I'm seeing some things that that concern me and may require my attention. I'm going to do the same thing for Catherine, for Krishan, and for Zainab. And when I look at their scores, looking at Bella, I can see that Bella's got a 40% on this perimeter and area test. Catherine's got a 30%, Krishan's got 50%, and Zainab has a 0%. So those four students in particular did not get scores we would like to see on this test. So we want to look at their data just a little bit closer. It's going to be like a little puzzle where we're not just interested in whether or not they met the acceptable criteria, whatever percentage that might be, a 75%, an 80%, or what number, but we want to begin thinking diagnostically. How is it that we can explain the score they got? And then how are we as teachers going to respond to what we see? So let's look just at Bella's scores. This is Bella's scores on all five tests. I know she scored a 40% on the most recent assessment, but looking back over her other scores, I want to see if I can find anything that might happen to be interesting. And to help you with this, I am going to go ahead and put up her final assessment as well as the scores. I did go ahead and type through what her responses might be, even though she would have handwritten those. I think the typing makes it a little easier for you to read. Do you notice anything interesting as you look at her information? Couple things that I as a teacher would have spotted. Um, I notice there's lots of evidence that she does understand perimeter and area. Notice she's got this perimeter problem correct. When I look over here, even though this answer is wrong, she does have the correct formula. She does have the correct numbers put in place. Correct formula, correct numbers, correct formula, correct numbers. Correct formula, correct numbers, no answer. There's a lot of really strong evidence that she's understanding perimeter and area in here. So how do we explain this low score? Do you notice anything about her test? Did you catch on to the fact that she's missed every problem that's involved a rational number that is not an integer? Notice when she had all integers on question 1, she gets it right. When she has all integers on question 6, she gets it right. When I ask a question down here that requires her to think a little bit more, notice I have a typo here, sorry about that. When I ask her to think a little bit more, she still gets the answer right, and she is able in words to describe the difference between perimeter and area. But every time I stick in some fractions or some mixed numbers, she gets the answer incorrect. What does that mean regarding what we need to do for her? Well, when I look back at her old tests, notice she did really well on integers. She did real well on basics of geometry. She did okay on angles and angle relationships. And based on what I'm seeing here, she really has a pretty good understanding of the perimeter and area of rectangles. The problem seems to be that she's having difficulty with rational numbers. If I'm thinking about the implications for instruction, well, it sounds as though she doesn't really need remediation on perimeter and area, even though that score is low. I really need to be focusing my attention on helping her with rational numbers. See how we're doing that? We're looking not just at a bad score, but we're looking at what we see overall and especially paying attention to the specific information given to us on the test to begin to make decisions. I would also argue that as an instructor, there's a couple other things I need to be aware of. Primarily, is this test measuring what it's intended to? If I've designed this test to measure her understanding of perimeter and area, but I'm penalizing her very, very significantly because she doesn't understand mixed numbers, do I have a problem with my test design? You've got two issues for Bella right now. Number one, test design. Number two, understanding of rational numbers. See how we're doing that? Let's try another student. Let's talk about Catherine for a minute. Notice when we look at Catherine's test, we see that she has earned a 30% on the perimeter and area of rectangles test. Remember, Bella earned a 40%, so Bella did slightly better on this test, but I think there's some other things we can notice on Catherine's paperwork and her scores that differentiate her from Bella. Why is Catherine's data interesting, especially in light of Bella's? Do you see anything? What if I were to put her test up here for you to see, or her assessment? How do her incorrect answers compare to the ones that Bella gave? Do you notice anything interesting? Here are some things that I see. I see that there are lots of unanswered questions. Notice these IDKs, IDKs, IDKs. We've got a blank spot here. It seems as though Catherine is really struggling even to get started on the problems. Remember we said with Bella, she was having trouble only on those problems that involve fractions and seemed to understand perimeter and area. Catherine, on the other hand, seems to be struggling in a much more significant way. I did notice that she does not write out formulas and she does not include units. Certainly those are signs that she may not be as well versed in practice in the proper procedures for solving to find area and perimeter. I always require my students to write formulas, and I certainly always require units on the answers. The fact that she has not done these things, even on the incorrect answers, is certainly a sign that there might be an issue. And it almost looks like on some of the problems she worked out that we just have guesses. Notice that she's tried to find the perimeter here, but she only added 2 sides. Notice here that she did find the area correctly, but down here, when we're trying to find areas, she uses the perimeter formula. There's no clear understanding demonstrated about which one is which and certainly when to use them. Notice down here we have perimeter, but she's worked it out as an area problem as well. What does that mean for us if we're trying to help Catherine in class as opposed to helping Bella? Can you generate some ideas on your own? You may want to pause the video and think about that. Here are some things that I would suggest. Catherine seems to be scoring fairly consistently poorly, not just on this test, but if you look at her previous tests as well, these are not what we would consider to be very, very strong scores. The fact that these are low and this is also low and seems to demonstrate a significant gap means there's probably something more significant going on in Catherine's math studies than there were in Bella's. Bella had a very specific identifiable issue, a content topic that we could go back and reteach and help her with. But Catherine's challenges seem to be much broader, a little more global. We need to begin looking at getting some more significant data on Catherine's abilities as well as her performance. We're going to start looking at her standardized test scores. We're going to look at her previous grades and talk to her previous teachers. We're going to look at her MAP test scores from either earlier this year or previous years. We're also going to begin looking at her Ohio State test forms, which is our state test here. We're going to look at those scores as well and see, is this something that is unique and new this year, or she had ongoing challenges in mathematics? Because regardless, we're going to begin having to have some discussions regarding some tier 2 interventions. What can we put in place globally to begin helping Catherine to improve? We need to start talking about about peer tutors, about one-on-one instruction, about small group instruction, about pull-out programs, possibly a 504 or an IEP. There's a lot more significant challenges when we're looking at Catherine's scores. Here's Krishan's data. Notice that Krishan also scored below what we would like to see on the perimeter and area of rectangles assessment. When you look at his data as a whole, do you see anything interesting? Here's his assessment. Do you notice anything there? If you need a second to pause and think about this, certainly please take a moment and do that. I don't want to just sit here in silence for the video. Here's what I noticed. He has done really well on the first 5 questions where he's been working problems out where we just gave him pictures. But as soon as I started using word problems, notice that we begin running into trouble. Notice that we have an area question here where he is given perimeter. Notice the perimeter is calculated correctly. And then we begin to see things like, I know this, or I know this question. Not only is he missing the problem, but he's not attempting the problem. And it looks like he's writing something for us and trying to help us see what he's thinking or where he's struggling. Notice as well we have an answer that's blank down here. He seems to understand perimeter and area, and his other scores up here at the top seem to suggest that he's a strong math student. When you look at all this data, what are the implications of that? What are you thinking? My first question is this student an English language learner? The fact that Krishan got everything right when it was pure math, but struggled as soon as I switched to word problems is a red flag. It is a shiny blinking light saying, hey, pay attention to this. Also, the fact that when he's telling us this, that these are not phrased in what we would consider to be typical or standard English is also an indication. If he's not an English language learner, then I would begin looking for other reading challenges. Maybe have a conference with his language arts instructor, or begin to go back and check the standardized test scores for reading, not just for math. Because the issue here seems to be specific to reading. I have one more student I want us to look at. That's Zainab. Zainab's scores are listed here. Do you notice anything interesting there? Maybe pause the video, take a second and think about that. Here's Zainab's test. What do you notice? Again, maybe pause the video, take a few moments and think about that. See if you can come up with some responses on your own. I have some things as a teacher that I'm looking for. First of all, this student really didn't even attempt to answer the problems. That's a red flag for us. Why did this student not try the problems? Overall, this student seems to be a pretty average student, seems to be very, very capable. When you look at some of the topics that are listed here, you'll notice that this student generally does pretty well. It seems to be something unique or specific to this. I also happen to notice, kind of as a side note, that this student seems to be a pretty talented artist. Instead of working on the mathematics I've given them, they seem to be more interested in doing some drawing. So what does that mean for this student? Well, it's probably not a comprehension issue. More than likely, this student is very, very capable of learning the things that we're asking them to learn. You'll notice both the geometry and the number sense seem to be in place. It's more likely that this student is having some kind of a social emotional issue. Either there's some kind of crisis going on that is not specifically related to the math, or there's been some kind of a crisis that has prevented this student from preparing for this test in the way that they ought to do. Either way, this warrants some kind of a conference with the student, if for no other reason than to let the student know that we're noticing that they're struggling, that we're concerned, that we actually care about what's going on in their life. The conference is a great opportunity to maybe take an interest in their artwork, take an interest in something that they enjoy and try and build some relationship. It's also a good opportunity to find out if there's anything that you can do to help or assist the student. Certainly, sometimes the student may just need more time, a second opportunity. There's a lot of different ways to reach out to the student, but it may be a point where you have to involve the counselor. Hopefully you've got a pretty good idea of some of the ways that we're using data. I wanted to illustrate 4 different students that all had poor scores, because one of the things we have a tendency to do as teachers is if we're not careful, just lump all bad scores in together. I wanted to make sure I emphasized for you that it's very important that you look past just the score and begin to look at what you're seeing on the students. There's nothing that can replace having your eyes as a professional on the actual student work. There's very little that can replace conversations with students as well. I did want to go back and talk about one other student from our list. I made a point of skipping this student to begin with. We've already talked about Bella, Catherine, Krishan, and Zainab, but there is one more student in here who really needs to have us pay some attention to them. Can you spot who that is? Maybe pause the video and look through the data. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I have a real interest right now in Jaden as well. I'm going to put Jaden's data up here by itself, because when I do that, you should notice something very, very interesting about Jaden's data. And that is, he's got perfect scores on everything we've done. What does that mean for him as a student? Well, we got to start asking, is this student gifted? Is he an overachiever? Is he just a hard worker, or is he just extremely talented in math? Because there's a chance that we may not be challenging Jaden as much as he needs. For him to get a perfect score on 5 assessments in a row, we have to start talking about things we can do to meet his needs in a regular classroom. How can we enrich him? How can we develop him? How can we help him to grow beyond the things that apparently he already knows? And then if we can't come up with some strategies for that, we need to begin having conversations about whether he needs to be subject or grade level accelerated. Maybe we need to begin involving a gifted intervention specialist. Maybe we need to begin talking to his other teachers and seeing about how he's doing in their class. But certainly this is a student we need to begin paying attention to. And chances are we're going to have to start reaching over into some gifted servicing of some kind for this student. I hope that hasn't been too overwhelming for you. I know some of it was pretty fast. I know we ran through a lot of information very, very quickly, but I'm trying to keep this short. The goal here, again, is to give you an idea of what we as teachers do when we're looking at student data the correct way and using student data to form instruction, not just to assign letter grades and values to what a student has achieved. As always, I do appreciate you taking the time to watch this. I appreciate you joining in with us. I do wish you the very, very best. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.